Now that you're familiar with the basic functions of node editing, I want to demonstrate how to build a practical material with common shader components and image textures. So we're going to take this sci-fi orb model and treat it like it's made of metal that has been painted and realistically worn and torn with grime and scratches. So let's list the elements that we will need. Number 1, a metallic element for the underlying surface. Number 2, a diffuse element for the paint color. 3, a reflective element for the paint finish so it's somewhat shiny. And finally, grime and scratch textures. And so let's approach our material construction in that order, starting with the metallic element. I will click and drag a box around our nodes, except for the material output, and delete them with the X hotkey. And when it comes to metallic surfaces, the main characteristic is reflection. And as you've already seen, the glossy BSDF gives us those reflections. So let's hit Shift A to bring up our Add menu. And in the shader section, I can choose glossy BSDF. But instead, I'm going to come down here to anisotropic BSDF. And then click on it, Shift Control click to plug it into our surface output. And as you can see in the preview render, it looks a lot like the glossy BSDF. In fact, if we come into the node for the anisotropy setting, if I turn that to 0, we essentially have a glossy BSDF. But this big weird term anisotropic represents the phenomenon that comes from brushed metal. And so if I crank the anisotropy to 0.7, keep an eye on our reflections when I hit enter, you'll see that our reflections are stretched across the surface vertically. And this stretching comes from very tiny abrasions in the surface that break up the reflection at a micro level, hence the brushed part of brushed metal. And just like the glossy BSDF, we have a color setting, which by default the value is set to 0.8, mainly operating under the principle that in reality, rarely does pure white exist. And so that's why they knock it down a little bit, but I go ahead and bump it up to pure white, just to, I guess, get the most out of my reflections. And then below that, we have a roughness setting just like the glossy. We can bump it up to make the reflections a little more dull, or we can go down, let's say to 0.01. And the further we go down, it just starts to look like chrome. We don't see any more of that stretching, which makes sense if you think about it, because if the anisotropic effect comes from micro abrasions in the surface, then as long as those abrasions are there, you're never going to have chrome. But since this is computer graphics, we can still stretch out the reflection. If I change the anisotropy to 1, you'll see that they start to stretch out, but it kind of defeats the purpose of simulating the anisotropy if you're simply stretching out chrome reflections. So really a value of 0.1 or really 0.2 I think will be a good value, and anisotropy back down to 0.7. And then finally below that we have a rotation setting, which allows us to simply rotate that stretched reflection around the orientation of our object. And so I think just slightly knocking it slanted like this will do fine. And I'm going to stop there, keep it simple for this metallic element. And we have a simplified version, sort of like what the Iron Man suit looked like before he painted it red and gold. Next, we'll add our paint color on top.